All right. So tonight we're going to take us a little tour of New Testament archaeology. Now I have quite the interest in New Testament archaeology that largely has been, I think, encouraged or developed by in my tours to Israel. I took a couple of tours to Israel with Cedar Park Church with Pastor Featon and Pastor Jay, one in 2015, another one in 2017, and it's something I would encourage of everyone. If it's something you can find, an opportunity you can find, I would definitely encourage it. For me, it was a tremendous motivator to learn more about the Bible. When you go on a trip with someone like Pastor Featon and Pastor Jay, you come away with it realizing how much you don't know. And you come away with it highly motivated to learn more about the history there, the history in the Bible, and as well developed within me a real heart for the Jewish people and what they have gone through as well. So, and it's something I would encourage everyone, if you have an opportunity to go, and go as soon as you can, for a couple of different reasons. Number one, tours like that. I know there's Pastor Jay and Pastor Featon have a tour scheduled coming up in April or March or April of next year. So you can look into that. But a couple of reasons why you want to try to go early. For these kind of trips, there's often a lot of walking involved, and you want to go when you're still young enough to be able to walk around and see everything, and as well, go as early as you can, because the sooner you go, the more of your life will be impacted by that trip. And for me, it has. It has lit a real fire under me, and I hope to go back again. I would have already gone back again on a tour since then, but they've shifted from summer to earlier in the year. It's a little warm there in the summer, and I think and a consideration of that, they've shifted from summer to earlier in the year, which makes it difficult if you're a school teacher, because taking off for 2 full weeks during the school year is really tough. That's a really hard thing. So we're going to take a little tour of New Testament archaeology, focusing most specifically on the historicity of Jesus. Not just his ministry, where he conducted his ministry, but more specifically, his crucifixion, the events surrounding his crucifixion. Can we support these events through archaeological findings? Interestingly, we can. Not just his crucifixion, but to some degree, his resurrection as well can be supported or substantiated through archaeology. Well, today, so I put on this screen the outline for tonight's talk, and as well, that's a QR code for the lecture notes. If you don't know how to use that, you just point your phone at that, and it'll cue you for a pop-up, and it'll let you download the lecture notes for this evening, which you can refer back to, and oftentimes I include additional comments there that I don't have a chance to get through in the lecture. Well, the reason why archaeology is so important is that today the Bible is under attack. And in particular, it's the historical content of the Bible that we find challenged by multiple science disciplines. Astronomy, biology, geology, and archaeology. Natural science, we have to understand, is arguing for a natural origin of the cosmos and life on Earth. And they argue that the Earth is much older than the Bible will allow for, and are teaching a natural history that differs from that which is taught in the Bible. And so it is very important for us to, as witnesses for Christ, to be able to provide answers to the challenges that are brought by natural science. See, natural science is teaching us a speculative history of the world, as though it's an absolute fact, a history of the world that is in great conflict with the history that's being taught in the Bible. And so to be an effective witness today, it is very important that we be able to defend the Bible against such false teachings, because that's what these teachings are of natural science, such as evolution. It's false teachings. These are lies. They're trying to convince us that this world formed all on its own through purely natural processes, and worse yet, that we're just a bunch of evolved apes. These are false teachings and outright lies. And it is important for us as witnesses for Christ that we defend the Bible against such false teachings. Well, any discussion regarding the archaeological support for the Bible would be incomplete without an inclusion of the case for textual authenticity. Can we trust the text as being true and valid? I mean, we have a text that goes back thousands and thousands of years. The New Testament is the newer portion, but still, you're looking at a text that is a couple of thousand years old. For the Old Testament, much older than that. Can we trust this text? A text that, for much of its history, was copied by scribes. Humans would copy the text over and over and over again. Can we be certain that the text we have today is the same as the text as it was originally written? Well, to examine to examine the case for the New Testament, let's first look at some other ancient texts for comparison. So we're going to look at some other texts from antiquity to see how the New Testament compares. And in particular, we're going to pay attention to the dates of the earliest copies that we have of these ancient texts, the time span involved from the date of the events to the earliest copy, and the number of surviving ancient manuscripts that are available for these texts. Again, just texts from antiquity that we can compare with the New Testament. So let's look at a few of these. Start with Herodotus. Herodotus was a Greek historian who lived in the 5th century BC, and today is widely regarded as the father of history. He's the father of the discipline that we call history, and yet the earliest copy of any manuscript we have from Herodotus date to around 900 AD. That's a full 1,300 years later. And we only have 8 ancient manuscripts that have survived. Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. He lived from 460 to 400 BC, and virtually everything we know about the Peloponnesian War comes from the writings of Thucydides. Yet to the earliest copy of any manuscript of Thucydides' work dates to around 900 AD. That's again about 1,300 years later. Caesar wrote the Gallic Wars. We have 10 Greek manuscripts that have survived to that, and the earliest dates to around 950 years after the original. Suetonius wrote the 12 Caesars. He was a Roman historian who lived between 70 and 100 AD. Yet the earliest copy of his book is dated to around 950 AD, a full 800 years later. And lastly, Tacitus wrote Annals. We have 20 surviving manuscripts of his work that can be considered ancient. The earliest dates to 950 years after the original. And these are some of the best preserved of these ancient manuscripts. Now let's compare this with the New Testament. The New Testament, by comparison, exists with close to 24,000 total ancient manuscripts. We have 5,300 in Greek, 10,000 in Latin, that's what we call the Vulgate, and 9,300 in other languages. A total of 230 manuscript portions are currently in existence, which predate 600 AD. But what really stands out is the time span to the earliest copy. Here are a few examples. The time span for these biblical manuscripts are all within 350 years of the originals, and one of them, the Magdalene manuscript, the one at the very top there, which contains a portion of Matthew 26, may even have coexisted the life of the author. The New Testament manuscript copies that we possess were compiled hundreds of years before the earliest copy of comparable secular manuscripts. This not only shows the importance that early Christians gave to preserving their scriptures, but illustrates the enormous wealth we have today for early biblical documentation. Here are a couple of, here's a look at a page from the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest and most valuable extant manuscripts of the Greek Bible, named for its place of housing in the Vatican Library. And here's the Codex Sinaiticus, which came to the attention of scholars only in 1844, when located at the Greek monastery that is believed to be on Mount Sinai, but Mount Sinai wasn't in the Sinai Peninsula. Paul clearly says that it was in Arabia. So probably not the true Mount Sinai where that monastery is, but that's a side point. In addition, thousands of early Christian writings and lectionaries from the 1st and 2nd century cite verses from the New Testament. In fact, it is nearly possible to put together the entire New Testament just from early Christian writings. So in summary, the case for the authenticity of the New Testament cannot possibly be stronger. The time gap between the original and the oldest existing manuscripts, the sheer number of ancient manuscripts and quotes from early Christian writings, with such a wealth of sources, there can be no doubt that the New Testament we have today is the same as it was written by the original writers. No doubt whatsoever. I mean, there's no book in existence that compares with the New Testament. The difference is so significant between other ancient manuscripts of the New Testament that a person would have to not just pause, take great pause at that, but be stunned by it. There's something very, very different about this book when you compare it to other books. The priority that past generations have taken to preserve this text for us shows that it's not just an ordinary text. There's something very, very different about it. Well, when talking about archaeological findings in Israel, one of the most important throughout Israel are the ancient synagogues around Galilee. Now, a synagogue, and this was one that we went to on one of my tours to Israel. This was one at Gamla, up in the Golan Heights. The synagogue is the Jewish equivalent of a church, more or less. It was the center of Jewish religious community, a place of prayer, study and education, social and charitable work would take place there, as well as it was served as a social center. It wasn't the temple. Sacrifices weren't conducted there, but it was comparable to the churches we have today. And today there are only 8 first century synagogues that have been found in all Israel. This again is one of them, an ancient, found in Gamla, which was an ancient city east of Galilee that was destroyed by the Romans in 67 AD to put down one of the Jewish revolt. Well, the reason why these synagogues are important is that we know from the Bible that Jesus traveled throughout Galilee teaching in these synagogues. Here from Matthew 4, Jesus was going throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness among the people. So we know Jesus traveled throughout Galilee teaching at these synagogues. And any of these synagogues that have survived to today can be very significant for a visit. And one of them in particular was for me. Just to be at a location where we know Jesus taught can be a very, very impactful thing. Well, one such synagogue where Jesus unquestionably taught many, many, many times was discovered at Capernaum, which is best known as being the home of Jesus when he lived in Galilee, and was also the site of many of his most profound miracles. In Matthew 9:1, it refers to Capernaum as his own city. It was Jesus' own city. Well, Capernaum was located on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. I've shown you the location of the Sea of Galilee right there, next to the Mediterranean. And its location, the location of Capernaum, shown there at the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum was on an important artery that linked Galilee to Caesarea Philippi to the north and Damascus, and thus became a prosperous town inhabited by fishermen, farmers, and merchants. It was established during the 2nd century BC and was a large Jewish village during the time of Jesus' activity in Galilee. In the late Roman and later Byzantine periods, the town occupied about 13 acres, a typical size for a town in antiquity. It continued to prosper throughout the 7th and 8th centuries, and then decline, was abandoned in the 11th century and remained largely unoccupied for more than a millennia. Capernaum was centrally located within the focal area of Jesus' early ministry, which is referred to as his evangelical triangle. That included not only Capernaum, but also Chorazin and Bethsaida. We will refer to this again later. Capernaum is not only the place where Jesus began his ministry, and it was also from there he appoints his first disciples with the oft-quoted call to discipleship, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Jesus initially calls Simon Peter and his brother Andrew to service, who were casting nets into the waters of the Sea of Galilee. Second, he asked the two other fishermen, James and his brother John, to follow him, and as they were preparing nets in a boat. All four immediately left their nets and followed Jesus. Jesus later calls Matthew, a tax collector, while he was sitting at his collection booth. It is this invitation, this call, the "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men," that led to the use of the fish as an ancient symbol of Christianity. The Jesus fish, or what we call the ichthys, is today an iconic symbol of Christian faith because of his phrase, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Well, as I mentioned, Jesus performed some of his most memorable miracles at Capernaum, healing many people and casting out many demons. In Mark 1:32, it says, people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. At Capernaum, he raised the 12-year-old daughter of the ruler of the synagogue from the dead. He cured the Roman centurion's servant after he sent word that Jesus does not need to personally even come because he knew that he had authority just like he does. I put in this slide that that the woman was healed by touching Jesus' garment after have been bleeding for 12 years. But in retrospect, I'm not certain that it is clear where that healing took place, that healing actually took place at Capernaum in retrospect. But he also healed a leper and instructs him to tell nobody. Instead, he tells many, and as a result, Jesus became unable to enter towns because he was so heavily mobbed by people wanting healings and food as well. And he started following him because he gave them free bread. Jesus also healed the paralytic that was lowered through the roof of but I want you to note, we're going to read through Mark 2 here, but note the location of where this miracle took place. When he came back to Capernaum, several days afterward, it was heard that he was at home. And many gathered together so that there was no longer room, not even near the door. And he was speaking the word to them. And they came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men, being unable to get to him because of the crowd. They removed the roof above him, and when they had dug an opening, they let down the pallet on which the paralytic was lying. And Jesus, seeing their faith, said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." So where did this miracle take place? He was at home. This miracle took place at Jesus' home. Jesus lived at Capernaum. So we know he lived there. We know he had a home there. We're going to come back to this here in a second. Well, the ancient ruins of Capernaum have been thoroughly explored by archaeologists and have become a popular tourist site for those visiting the land of Israel. However, it wasn't until the 19th century that the site became known. Although tradition held that the ruins of Capernaum were located on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, the remains of a synagogue was first discovered, correctly identified by the American scholar Edward Robinson in 1838. Robinson initially referred to the place as desolate and mournful, but upon finding the ancient synagogue, described what he found as the prostrate ruins of an edifice which for expense, labor, and ornament surpasses anything we have yet seen in Palestine. What you're seeing right there is a look at the synagogue. We're going to take another look at it. The rest of it was the reconstruction of the town site. And you might have also noted the church that has been built on the site as well. We're going to be referring to this as well. Well, in 1894, the Franciscan custody of the Holy Land acquired a large area of ancient Capernaum from the Bedouins, including the synagogue, and fenced off the area to protect it against vandalism. Between 1905 and 1915, the Franciscans allowed a more extensive excavation of the site. In 1921, a synagogue was partially restored by one of the Franciscans, a guy that many Orfali of Nazareth, who also partly uncovered an octagonal church and exposed the town in between the synagogue and the church. So you'll see them noted on this slide. After the death of Orfali, no work was conducted on the site for nearly 40 years. Let me give you a little look at some of the site. The synagogue that you see here is made of white limestone, which is distinct from the local rocks that have been used for the town site, which are basalt, a black basalt. Most of the town reconstruction that you saw in that early video was it's black basalt. So the white limestone that you see in the synagogue really stands out. You can see I had to take a selfie from one of my trips to Israel. You got to include selfies. So forgive me for that. You'll see some of the ornate columns here from the synagogue. It included an outer courtyard. This is the doorway leading from the courtyard into the synagogue. Jewish motifs abound at the synagogue. This engraving that you see, so you can see the menorah there, engraving of a menorah. This carving that you see here is of a chariot, which is widely regarded as depicting the Ark of the Covenant. However, to my knowledge, the only time the Ark of the Covenant was on wheels like this was when David mistakenly had it put on a cart, causing the death of I don't remember his name, a guy that tried to stabilize it and was killed. So whether this is actually of the Ark of the Covenant or not, I tend to question. But that's what it's widely regarded as being. Well, from 1968 to 1991, another Franciscan archaeologist conducted excavations for 19 seasons, concentrating first on the two public buildings of the town, the octagonal church and the synagogue. It was these later excavations that ultimately resulted in the sensational discovery of a basalt foundation of the first century synagogue that was built by the Roman centurion. The white limestone synagogue that was in the previous picture is Byzantine era, but that synagogue was built on a much older foundation of a public building, and is widely believed that there was an older synagogue at that site that was later restored with the white limestone synagogue we see there today. You can see from these pictures the black basalt foundation that is beneath the white limestone synagogue. This is an excavation trench that was dug to expose that earlier foundation. So that foundation you see there is the foundation of the synagogue that existed at the time of Jesus, and one where he would have taught many, many, many times. Well, in addition to the synagogue, the ruins of a 5th century octagonal church shown here was discovered. Now, structures like this were frequently built over sites of importance to preserve them. You notice the church is octagonal. Octagonal churches or even rooms were built for two reasons. One, they noted a baptistry that was the site of a baptistry. This other reason that they were built was often to, as I mentioned, to preserve the site of an important event, most typically martyrdoms. So if a person was martyred at a site, they would try to preserve the location of that martyrdom by building a church on it that was either octagonal, or for some that were cruciform, that were shaped like crosses. So, assuming this might be the case, Franciscan archaeologists excavated under the octagonal church that you see there and discovered a room beneath. Notice that there's an outer octagon, an inner octagon, and an even more central octagon of the church. Well, under that smaller octagon, when they excavated underneath, they found a room was beneath it, which was being preserved by the church that had been built on top of it. A room that is called the venerated room. This was found directly beneath that innermost octagon, and it is identified today as Peter's house, the home of Peter. And I'll show you here in a little bit, but a new church has been built over it, and it's the Church of St. Peter. But this assertion that this is the house of Peter I will contest. The venerated room was generally square. The venerated room beneath that octagon was generally square, and like others in Capernaum, was part of a large cluster of rooms that shared a large courtyard that is believed to have looked like this. And it is suggested that several families may have lived together in this manner. Excavation trenches of the room revealed occupational layers which contain evidence of daily life, such as jars, cooking pots, bowls, lamps were discovered that were dated from the 2nd century BC to the late 1st century AD. Above these layers was found at least 6 superimposed layers of white plaster that had originally decorated the inner walls of the room. That is why it's referred to as the venerated room. This room had been plastered floor to ceiling over and over and over again, multiple times. The only evidence of occupation, of living at this level, was pieces of Herodian lamps that were found embedded in the white plaster pavements, and those were dated to the second half of the 1st century AD, and no later than the beginning of the 2nd century. Now, this room is very unique, and that's the only one that was found in all of Capernaum that had white plaster like this. No other room was found in all of Capernaum that was so decorated. These special conditions led scholars to conclude that the house was used for community gatherings as early as the 3rd quarter of the 1st century AD. So people started using it as a meeting house. An animation will help me describe and help you understand the history of the site's use. During the late 4th century AD, the cluster of homes where Peter is believed to have lived was modified into a church called the Domus Ecclesia, while leaving the venerated room standing as a focal point for the gatherings. Several of the houses adjacent to the room were torn down, and an impressive enclosure wall was built. Peter's home, received some significant renovations, including a new polychrome pavement, an arch was added, an atrium and a side chamber were added. Inner walls of the house were then plastered and decorated with colorful geometric patterns and floral motifs. Graffiti in the form of symbols and monograms were found in several languages, including Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. The graffiti found gives clear testimony that the site was used by early Christians. The names and monograms of Jesus occur in several instances, including the description of him as Lord, Christ, Most High, and God. Then later in the 5th century, the octagonal Byzantine church that was built on the site to preserve the location of that room. In 1990, the Franciscans built a modern octagonal church with a glass floor overlooking the excavations, a church that is called the Church of the House of St. Peter. Well, as I mentioned, the question is begged, however, why is it concluded that this is Peter's home, one of Jesus' disciples, and a church built in his name? Now, again, Matthew 19 refers to Capernaum as Jesus' own city. Matthew 4:13 reads, "And leaving Nazareth, he came and settled in Capernaum." He settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea. Now, I'll ask this question. If you knew Jesus lived in Capernaum, if you knew a bunch of his disciples also lived in Capernaum, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Matthew, if you know all those guys lived in Capernaum and you were a 1st century Christian and you wanted to, whose home would you have been most interested to see? Would you have converted the room that Jesus lived into a true church, or would you have converted the room that Peter lived into a church? Would you have conducted pilgrimages to visit the room that Jesus lived in Capernaum, or would you have gone on a pilgrimage to see the room where Peter lived in Capernaum? It seems obvious to me. But what puzzles me and troubles me about this is I can seem to find no one else asking the question. No one else questioning this. It just seems so obvious to me that this was Jesus' room. Now note that it wasn't the entire compound that was venerated. There were multiple rooms that were part of this structure. Only one room was venerated in this way. Now, could Peter have owned the compound? It's possible, I guess. But Andrew, James and John might have also owned it. They also lived in Capernaum. Matthew might have also owned it, and he would have been the most wealthy. If anyone had a big house with an empty guest room, I would think it would have been Matthew. Now, many argue, and rightly so, that Jesus was an itinerant preacher, traveling from place to place, and they point to Matthew 8:20, where Jesus said, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. This is in response to someone that asked him to follow him. So, clearly at some point in his ministry, this almost certainly became the case, but settling at Capernaum, as it says in Matthew 4:13, denotes a permanent residence at that point in his life. And the towns of his evangelical triangle, the focal point of his ministry, were only a short distance away from Capernaum. Now, some argue that Jesus may have lived with Peter and quote this passage from Matthew 8 as a reference which implies that Jesus was at Peter's home until the evening came. Matthew 8:14-16. When Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and waited on him. When evening came, they brought to him many who were demon possessed, and he cast out the spirits with the word and healed all who were ill. But it is also clear that Jesus was in residence in Capernaum before even meeting Peter and calling him to be his disciple. From John 1:35-43. Again, the next day, now it's referring to John the Baptist. Then the next day, John the Baptist was standing with his two disciples, and he looked at Jesus and as he walked and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." The two disciples of John the Baptist heard him speak, and they followed him. And Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What do you seek?" They said to him, "Rabbi," which translates teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come, and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He found first his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah." So Jesus was living in Capernaum before he even met Peter. Now, could he have moved in with Peter later? It could be, but there's no reference to indicate that that has occurred, and there's actually nothing about that venerated room that ties it to Peter in any way. It was simply venerated, became the site of a meeting, became a place for meetings, for having church services and pilgrimages during the 1st and 2nd century, and it just seems obvious to me that that was Peter's home. That was Jesus' home in Capernaum, not Peter's. So why are we calling it Peter's home? Well, this is one of Satan's main strategies, to get us to take our eyes off Jesus, to idolize anything else or anyone else. We are terribly prone to idolatry. We tend to venerate people. We elevate people who did some good service to the level of a saint, and then, good grief, they start praying to these people and such. It's been a terrible practice of humanity to venerate people, and I think this is a sad case. So instead of this church celebrating Jesus' life and ministry at Capernaum, it's honoring Peter, and it's just, I think, a terrible thing. Well, although Capernaum was famous as a place where Jesus began his ministry and the many miracles that he performed there, and the archaeological discoveries of the octagonal church and the synagogue, It has gone down in infamy for its condemnation. Along with Bethsaida and Chorazin, Jesus condemned them for their failure to repent. Woe to you, says Jesus. Woe to you, Chorazin. Woe to you, Bethsaida. For if the miracles had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Nevertheless, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will not be exalted to heaven, will you? You will descend to Hades. For if the miracles had occurred in Sodom, which occurred in you, it would have remained to this day. Nevertheless, I say to you that it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you. Whew. Why did Jesus curse these cities? Because of their failure to repent. Ultimately, the gospel message is a message of repentance. That is the central gospel message. That is what the prophets preach. That's what John the Baptist preached, and that's what Jesus preached. The book of Matthew, the beginning of ministry, says from that time on, Jesus said, repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. That's the central gospel message. Repent. Turn away from those sins. Well, another important synagogue was discovered in Magdala. Now, Magdala was the birthplace of Mary Magdalene. She was Mary from Magdala. Now, Magdala was also located on the Sea of Galilee, only about 6 miles from Capernaum, where Jesus lived. And so we can be fairly certain that Jesus taught at the synagogue at Magdala as well. Now, Magda is an active archaeological site. I took this video of the archaeological digs taking place there when I went on my tour to Israel with Pastor Featon in June 2015. When I went back in 2017 with Pastor Featon and Pastor Jay, the excavations in this area, where I'm videotaping right now, had been completed and some of the structures had been restored. This picture is of that same place. This is what it looked like in 2017. At this location, they found 3 private homes with ritual purification baths that are called mikvahs. But the baths that they found in these homes were very, very significant, very important. They were spring-fed, interconnected ritual baths, the first that have been found in Israel that use spring water, which for purification purposes was considered the best because it was living water rather than rainwater. Well, the most spectacular discovery that was made at Magdala was a first century synagogue shown here that was found just in 2009 while they were doing rescue archaeology before the construction of a retreat center at the site. See, in Israel, before you can build anything, you first got to do some archaeological digs, some probes, to determine if there's anything of significance there that will be destroyed by the construction. Like I say, that's how they discovered the Pool of Siloam, was by putting in a sewer line. Well, the synagogue in Magdala is currently the oldest found in all of Galilee. A coin minted in Tiberias, an Israel city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, was found inside the synagogue that dated to 29 AD. The city was later buried by a flash flood, and the ancient city remained buried until the excavations began there in 2009. No coinage or artifacts were found that were dated after 67 AD, the year of the Jewish revolt. Therefore, it can be confidently concluded that the synagogue was from the first century, the time of Jesus' ministry. This synagogue is the best preserved of the synagogues found around Galilee, the only first century synagogue found with frescoes, shown here, and mosaics, shown here. You see the mosaics on the floor. At the far end of this mosaic, there's this circular pattern that you see there. Well, what caused archaeologists to immediately recognize that a synagogue was at this location was actually that carved stone that you see in the distance right there. It was the discovery of this stone that told them that they had found a synagogue. The stone is believed to have been used by priests while reading from the Torah, kind of a scroll stone. You would set the scroll on top of the stone and roll it out. Here's a little better look at it. This is a replica that is just outside of the synagogue in a glass case for you to look at. Its top and four sides were adorned with reliefs, including a 7-branch menorah that you see here, set atop a pedestal with a triangular base, which is flanked on either side by amphora, jars. Now, this is very significant because it's the first time that a menorah carving has been discovered from the days when the Second Temple was still standing. So the person who carved this had actually seen the menorah that was standing in the temple. We can also point to some archaeological discoveries that support the historical events that surround the crucifixion of Jesus. For this, we want to look at some ossuaries. What you see here are burial ossuaries, what are also known as bone boxes. Now, these are important archaeological artifacts that were used, oddly, during the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD only. They appear to be used for this very narrow period of time, for the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. And I find that very interesting, that they were only used for a brief period of time. See, the Romans did cremation. And of course, the use of tombs was very common, but why was it that they started preserving bones like this? Well, if you know that there was a long-standing debate about whether or not the resurrection was physical or spiritual. Even Paul addresses this in some of his writings, the debate. Remember, the Sadducees didn't even believe there was a resurrection, and those that did, it was debated whether it was physical or spiritual. What is it? There's even one of the major prophets that refers to flesh coming back on these old dry bones. Is that Ezekiel? Someone help me? It seemed like Ezekiel. And so it was a long-standing debate about whether the resurrection was physical or spiritual. But something happened in this narrow period of time that caused the balance to shift significantly towards the physical. And that was during this period of time, a whole bunch of people were raised from the dead. Jesus raised a good number of people from the dead. I mean, he stopped a burial procession at one point and raised a boy that was during the middle of a burial procession, a girl, and then Lazarus. And then after his resurrection, or after his crucifixion, a whole bunch of people came out of the tombs and were wandering around. I think this caused people just to assume that the resurrection was going to be physical, and they started preserving bones in bone boxes for that anticipation. Well, Jews who could afford this type of burial would, what they would do, they would lay out dead bodies of loved ones in a rock-cut tomb. Such tombs would include an area where the most recent death in the family would lie on a chiseled-out rock bench. A family member would later come into the chamber about a year after the death, take the bones after the flesh had decomposed and decayed, and place the bones in an ossuary, which would then remain in the tomb with those of other family members. You see that this tomb has a good number of bone boxes in it, a good number of ossuaries. This was this picture. I took this picture on the tour of Israel of a tomb that's on the Mount of Olives, just outside the church there, that's called Dominus Flebit, which means the Lord wept. A beautiful, ornate church there on the Mount of Olives. Well, in 1990, a tremendously ornamental ossuary was discovered in a burial chamber in Jerusalem, along with 11 others that were dated to the 1st century. Inside this ossuary was found the bones of several individuals, 2 babies, an adolescent child, a teenage boy, an adult woman, and a man of about 60 years of age. The ossuary is believed to belong to Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. shown here in a 14th century fresco, tearing his robes in grief at Jesus' perceived blasphemy. Let's read a little bit of the text. Those who seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. Now the chief priest and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward and said, "This man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered, "He deserves death." So this whole trial was it was completely out of form and out of practice. The Sanhedrin, you might call it the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin didn't meet at night like this. And when an accused was being interrogated, the high priest didn't speak. The high priest didn't encourage for decisions to be made against a person like this. So this was all of a mob mentality kind of rush to judgment. What was happening here? It's terrible. Well, on the side of the ornate ossuary was inscribed the identity of the owner, Yosef bar Caiaphas, which translates means Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Well, the first century historian Flavius Josephus provides the only contemporary mention of Caiaphas outside the Talmud and the New Testament, and identifies the high priest at the time of Jesus as Joseph, who was called Caiaphas. Josephus tells us additionally that Caiaphas was the Jewish high priest from 18 to 36 AD. And there's further evidence to place the burial site of the first century. A bronze coin minted in 42 to 43 AD during the reign of Herod Agrippa I was found in one of the ossuaries. It is, interestingly, the first known example of perhaps the pagan practice at a Jewish burial site. I'm referring to the pagan practice, a custom of the Greeks to place a coin in the mouth of a deceased to pay the god Charon in exchange for passage across the river Styx. Is that why the coin was there? Can't say for sure, but it's interesting. In summary, the inscription and the dating of the ossuary to the first century supports the artifact as belonging to the high priest Caiaphas, and therefore it provides a very important piece of archaeological evidence supporting the historicity of the crucifixion of Jesus. Well, at Caesarea Maritima, another important discovery was made related to the history and crucifixion of Jesus. Caesarea Maritima was a jewel of antiquity located on the coast of the Mediterranean. It was built by Herod the Great as an urban center beginning in 22 BC. It was complete with a theater, a hippodrome. I will show you some of these in a second. He had a promontory palace on the site. There was a beautiful aqueduct that was built, bringing water to Caesarea Maritima, and a magnificent harbor. This is an artist's conception of what the harbor looked like during New Testament times. It was 40 acres in size, built with concrete piers. They had developed a technique of pouring concrete in water. It had concrete piers and would accommodate close to 300 ships. Well, several important biblical events are recorded in Acts that taking place in Caesarea. Philip journeyed to Caesarea after baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. Peter baptized the Roman centurion Cornelius and his family in Caesarea, beginning the ministry of salvation amongst the Gentiles. Herod Agrippa, after allowing the people to idolize and praise him as a god, received judgment and died from worms in Caesarea. Paul's missionary trips frequently ended in Caesarea's large port, and after his last journey, he stayed with Philip and the believers in Caesarea before going to Jerusalem. Once imprisoned for his faith, Paul was sent to Caesarea and appeared before the governors Felix and Festus, as well as King Agrippa. Paul eventually appealed to Caesar after spending 3 years under house arrest in Caesarea, likely in a cell below Herod's palace. I'll show you a few pictures from Caesarea that I took in 2015 of some of the reconstructions of fortifications and public structures at Caesarea. These are probably Crusader era reconstructions. Here's another look at some of those. Here's a picture of the theater that's at Caesarea. I had to, although I was there personally, I had to get this picture off the internet because when I was there was a huge stage that had been erected for some event that was getting ready to take place there. It is still used for public events. Much of the upper rows have been restored. For many of these, they have been, but they usually leave some of the original stones in place and then restore above that. You can even, if you look closely at this picture, you can even see some blue chairs down at the very bottom row of the theater that still being used today. Here's a look at the Hippodrome that was at Caesarea. Now, Hippodrome was basically a horse/chariot racetrack, but fairly massive, 250 meters long. This Hippodrome was 250 meters long and is estimated to probably have something close to 10,000 seats. You can see the seating there on the right side of this photograph. As I mentioned, Herod also built an aqueduct to bring water into Caesarea from springs at Mount Carmel, about 10 miles away. And of course, if you have public facilities like a hippodrome, you need public toilets as well. These are some of the public toilets that were right outside the entry to the hippodrome, which was also equipped with running water. Running water flowed through this. The Romans were masters of water usage. Well, there was an important discovery made at Caesarea that verifies the existence of Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate was the prefect or governor of the Roman province of Judea from 26 to 36 AD, and the person who ordered Jesus to be crucified. The Jewish high priests at the time were unable to legally sentence a man to death. Most of the leading Jews wanted Jesus killed, but the death sentence decreed by the Sanhedrin had to be carried out under Roman law. Therefore, they formed and incited a mob to demand that Pilate order his death, which he reluctantly gives into. Let's read a little bit of the text. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. Then he goes out to address the mob. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" Pilate asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Well, in 1961, archaeologists discovered a stone while excavating the theater at Caesarea that had an inscription that refers to Pontius Pilate. This is a replica of that stone displayed near the site of Herod's palace. In the background, behind the stone, is where Herod's palace was located. Now, the inscription is part of a commemoration of a temple that Pilate built in Caesarea and dedicated to the worship of the Emperor Tiberius. Easily visible on this stone are the words Pilatus for Pilate and Tiberium, which is the name for the temple of Tiberius. Now, interestingly, Pilate is the only known Roman official to have built a temple to a living emperor. See, the Romans did emperor worship. People also engaged in Rome worship. I mean, it was very advantageous to a city to worship an emperor because much favor would be gained by that. But it was customary to do this for emperors that were no longer living. This was the only a time that I'm aware of a Roman authority building a temple for a current emperor in this way. And it seems to have it reveals a weakness in Pilate, either psychologically or in his position as an official, to have built a temple for a current emperor. Again, in the cult of emperor worship, typically non-Roman rulers would deify a Roman emperor after their death as a sign of devotion and loyalty to Rome. For example, Herod the Great built 3 temples in Caesarea, 3 temples to Caesar Augustus, one of which he erected in Caesarea Maritima. Pilate building a temple to a living emperor as a Roman official was over the top and clearly meant to display exaggerated devotion to the current ruler, likely in the hope of gaining favor, something that probably did not work well for Pilate since Tiberius had forbidden people from dedicating temples to himself. Or so says Suetonius, the Roman historian that we referred to previously. Well, this is a strong verification for the historical accuracy of the narrative describing the crucifixion of Jesus. Scripture identifies Tiberius Caesar as the emperor when Pilate was the governor of Judea. Here in Luke 3, it says, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee. It also fits well with the first century world described in the Bible. The prefect usually lived in Caesarea and only would travel to Jerusalem for special occasions, and it therefore makes sense that Pilate would build a temple in Caesarea and dedicate it to the way he did. The dating of the inscription in connection with its mention of Tiberius places the governor Pontius Pilate at the same place and time as the Bible's information about Jesus. However, as with the Caiaphas ossuary, then the inscription supports the historical reliability of the cross by supporting the existence of one of the central characters involved in the event. It doesn't specifically support the crucifixion of Jesus, but the historical narrative around it is well verified by the discovery. Well, crucifixion was a painful and torturous execution method wherein a prisoner was most often tied to a large wooden beam and left to hang often for several days until they would eventually die from asphyxiation. Well, due to the severe difficulty of inhaling while being hung, the victim would have to pull themselves up by their arms, or frequently the Romans would place a wooden block beneath their feet so they could push up so they could stand up on their feet to take a breath as well, which only really was a way of prolonging the torture, just prolonged the length of time that they would hang there on the cross. Without the ability to push themselves up by their feet like that, death would occur much more quickly. It was a terrible and torturous method. What would tend to happen after eventually becoming exhausted and unable to lift themselves, the condemned would die within a few minutes, or after the prisoner's legs were broken, as was described in the crucifixion of Jesus. They came to break his legs, but he was already dead. The method was used for over 1,000 years. However, prior to 1968, no physical evidence of the practice had been discovered. In 1968, however, an ossuary Another bone box was discovered in Jerusalem that dates to the 1st century and contains the bones of a prisoner who had been crucified in the same manner. Inside was discovered the heel bones of a man who had been nailed to a cross. But note the position of the nails is evidence that of the crucifixion technique that had not been previously known. The man's feet had been affixed to the sides of the beam rather than through the front, as we typically see it depicted in paintings and such. Notice how it's driven through the sides. So this is how Jesus was crucified, with a huge nail being driven through his ankles, and to breathe, he would have to stand up on that nail to take a breath. And I would have to believe that every single time he was forced to stand up on that nail, he would scream in agony, take a breath or two, and then have to drop back down. Just think of what our Lord did to pay the penalties for our sins. Well, there was an important inscription discovered that also may refer to not just the crucifixion of Jesus, but his resurrection. This is referred to as the Nazareth inscription tablet, which is shown here. It was discovered in Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus. I've noted the location there, in 1878, although it went unknown to the world for almost 50 years. The inscription is frequently cited as a secular source of early origin that bears testimony to Jesus' empty tomb. It is a tablet that contains a public proclamation from a Roman emperor that may have been released in response to the request from Jewish leaders who were outraged at what they believed was the theft of the body of Jesus Christ by the apostles who sought to fake his resurrection. The edict is thought to have come from Claudius Caesar, who ruled shortly after Jesus' resurrection from 41 to 54 AD and is dated to 41 AD. Now we know from Matthew 27 that the Pharisees were concerned about the possibility that some of the disciples would come and steal the body and tell people that he had been raised from the dead. Here we have Matthew 27. Now, on the next day, the day after the day of preparation, the chief priest and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I am to rise again.' Therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day, otherwise his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead,' and the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard, go make it secure as you know how." And they went and made the grave secure, and along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. Well, here is the text of the Nazareth inscription, translated from the Greek. It reads, "Edict of Caesar. It is my decision concerning graves and tombs, whoever has made them for religious observances or of parents or children or household members, that these remain undisturbed forever. But if anyone legally charges that another person has destroyed or has in any manner extracted those who have been buried, or has moved with wicked intent those who have been buried to other places, committing a crime against them, or has moved sepulchre, ceiling stones against such a person, I order that a judicial tribunal be created, just as is done concerning the gods' and humans' religious observances. Even more so, will it be obligatory to treat with honor those who have been entombed. You are absolutely not to allow anyone to move those who have been entombed. But if someone does, I wish that violator to suffer capital punishment under the title of tomb breaker." So I don't know, it's interesting. Well, this is an edict specifically related to Jesus' empty tomb. We can't say for certainty, but the dating and the events seem to suggest it. And I think very interesting that was found in Nazareth. Well, in October 2002, the Biblical Archaeology Review announced the discovery of another bone box, a 2,000-year-old bone box, which might belong to James, the brother of Jesus. The ossuary contained an inscription reading, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Scientists at the prestigious Geological Survey of Israel verified the authenticity of the ossuary itself, and world-renowned epigrapher Andre Lemire, an expert in ancient scripts, authenticated the inscription. As this was the first historical record found of Jesus apart from manuscripts, it might be the most significant New Testament discovery in modern times. James is referred to as the Lord's brother in Matthew 13:55 and Mark 6:3 and Galatians 1:19. Here for Matthew 13 it reads, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary and his brothers James, etc.?" James is considered by most scholars to be the author of the New Testament epistle of James, and upon the crucifixion of Jesus, James assumed leadership of the Christian church in Jerusalem until he was martyred in 62 AD. In 2003, the ossuary and its inscription were examined extensively by the Royal Ontario Museum in Canada, where it was displayed from 2002 to 2003. Ed Keel, the director of the Near Eastern and Ancient Civilizations Department of the Royal Ontario Museum, said this: "We looked over the box very carefully and subjected to analytical testing using a light polarizing microscope, ultraviolet light, a microscope with 60 times the magnification, and an electron microscopy. I'm very comfortable saying that the ossuary itself and the inscription are totally genuine, and everything we found was consistent with considerable age. However, few people know about its existence because the validity of the Yeshua inscription was later attacked by the Israeli Antiquities Authority, which appointed a committee of 14 scholars to examine the find, and on June 2003 announced in a press conference that the James ossuary was a forgery. Surprisingly, this Israeli Antiquities Authority never offered any detailed report explaining why it concluded the ossuary was a forgery that would allow the Royal Ontario Museum to reevaluate its findings. And thus the museum remains to today in support of its authenticity. In addition, one of the scholars appointed by the Israeli Antiquities Authority later decided that the inscription was genuine. The Israeli Antiquities Authority reported this: "The ossuary is authentic. Its inscription is a forgery. All the various scratches on the ossuary are coated with in the original patina, and only the inscription and its immediate surroundings are coated with an artificial patina, like a material of round crystalline granules. The inscription cuts through the original patina and appears to have been written by two different writers using different tools." The story goes on. In July of 2003, arrests were made, and authorities claimed to have found extensive evidence of forgery activity. The accused was released pending further investigation. 5 people were charged a year later on 18 counts of forgery, fraud, and damaging archaeological artifacts. Charges against 2 of the defendants were dropped before trial, and a third pled guilty to unrelated charges, leaving 2 defendants to stand trial, Oded Golan and Robert Dush. Problems, however, abounded at the trial, which lasted 4 years. Not a single expert on Semitic inscriptions of the period testified that the ossuary was a forgery. The government's principal witness, Professor Gorn, the former chair of the Tel Aviv University's archaeological department, was even forced during the trial to admit under cross-examination that he could see original patina in the critical word Yeshua. With that admission, the case fell apart. In addition, several scientists offered testimony against Professor Gorn, and none verified his claims of forgery. The defendants, who maintained their innocence throughout the ordeal, were eventually vindicated, along with the Biblical Archaeology Review, which has consistently supported the authenticity of the inscription. More than 4 years, 75 witnesses, 5,000 pages of testimony. After all that, the judge advised the prosecution to drop their case. Then the defendants were acquitted of all forgery charges, resulting in a major embarrassment for the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Why did they claim it was a forgery? Well, think about who Jesus is. And they don't believe he was the Messiah. Well, if the inscription is indeed authentic, then the case is very strong, especially considering that the bone box was limited to a use in that very specific period of time, from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. Well, although the names James, Joseph, and Jesus were common in the region, the statistical probability of those three names belonging to brothers and a father is statistically improbable. It just seems very improbable that those names and relationship combinations would be referring to anyone else in that specific time and region, and thus strongly supports the ossuary belonging to the brother of Jesus Christ. Furthermore, although placing the name of a father on an ossuary was somewhat common, placing the name of a brother was completely unheard of. You never place the name of a brother on an ossuary like this. Furthermore, placing the name of a brother on an ossuary who had been crucified makes no sense, because this was your brother who was a criminal. You don't place the name of your brother who was a criminal on your bone box unless you believe that person was in fact of great importance. My intention this evening was also to give you a little bit of an excerpt on the Shroud of Turin, which you might have heard of, and you might have heard some bad things about as well. I'm running really low on time, so I'm going to try to skip through this and show you some of the arguments for the Shroud of Turin. Now, if you don't know what the shroud was, Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth bearing the image of a man that many believe may have been, and many believe that this may have been the burial shroud that Jesus was wrapped in at his crucifixion. Now, this is the full-length cloth that you see here. On the right side, you have the image of the ventral or front of the man, and the back of the man is on the left side. Let me flip it around for you. Here's a closer look at the front of the cloth, showing the face and the hands that are folded. The darkened triangles on either side of the body are from fire damage, which occurred in the year 1532, and that were patched. Those triangles are patches from burn damage. Let me flip it around. Here's a closer look at the back of the cloth, showing the tremendous number of injuries the man suffered. The back is literally covered with bloodstains from wounds indicating extreme torturing had taken place. The presence of blood was even confirmed by tests for bilirubin, a compound that forms during the breakdown of red blood cells, or more specifically during the breakdown of heme, a component of the hemoglobin. Well, few people are aware of the Shroud of Turin because in 1988, carbon-14 dating of it was done, and it was subsequently claimed that it was a forgery from the medieval period. The scientists who did the carbon-14 dating are shown here during a press conference where they presented the results, arguing that it was made in the time period between 1260 and 1390. You can see written there on the blackboard behind them. You can see the exclamation mark next to the time period, gives an indication of the emotions that existed during the presentation. However, some new research resulted in the Catholic Church allowing a rare public viewing of the shroud at a televised service just a few years ago at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. The shroud had not been shown prior to this for close to 40 years. Permission for the showing was given by Pope Emeritus Benedict before leaving office. Pope Francis gave a video message on the shroud during the live television broadcast. The reason why it came up is because of some new research. Research that prompted the showing of the shroud was conducted by what is known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, which has cast some serious doubts on those original carbon-14 dates. Fanti, a professor of mechanical and thermal measurement at Padua University, used infrared light spectroscopy and other methods to analyze the fibers which were taken from the shroud during the previous study and for carbon-14 dating in 1988. He found dates consistent with the biblical narrative. Fanti states, final results show that the shroud fibers examined produced the following dates, all of which are 95% certain and centuries away from the medieval dates obtained using carbon-14 testing in 1988. The dates given to the shroud from infrared testing is between 300 BC to plus or minus 400 years. 200 BC plus or minus 500 years was obtained from Raman testing, and 400 AD plus or minus 400 years was obtained after multi-parametric mechanical testing. The average of all three dates was 33 BC plus or minus 250 years from these three different age dating techniques. Well, in addition to those challenges, let me point to a couple of other things that causes people to look at the Shroud of Turin as being something that is very ancient. And one of the things that makes the Shroud of Turin very bizarre is that the image on the shroud is a negative image, where in a negative it is dark where it should be light, and vice versa, like in our negatives for photographs. When filters were used to reverse the image to a positive, this was the result. And here is a look at both sides of the cloth seen as a positive. Well, the existence of the shroud, or one similarly described, you could argue, can be traced all the way back to at least the 6th century. The mandilion was a cloth that was believed to be miraculously imprinted with the image of Christ and found in the ancient city of Edessa, Syria, now Turkey. It was mentioned in 525 in writings of a court historian who described its discovery after a flood. It had apparently been hidden in a wall above one of the gates of Edessa and discovered during the course of the reconstruction work after the flood. Scholasticus also writes in his ecclesiastical history in 593 of a miraculous imprint of a face of Jesus upon a cloth, the possession of which aided in the defense of Edessa against the Persians in 544. The cloth was moved to Constantinople in the 10th century, then disappeared during the 4th century sack of Constantinople in 1204. the Fourth Crusade, sack of Constantinople, 1204, reappearing at least in part as a relic in King Louis IX's court in France, who reigned from 1226 to 1237. The cloth, known today as the Shroud of Turin, was first recorded as being in the possession of a French soldier who died in the Battle of Pontius in 1356. The shroud later changed hands several times until it was acquired in 1453 by the Royal Italian House of Savoy. It then was relocated to Chambéry, France, where it was damaged by a fire in 1532, producing those marks that we saw previously. In 1578, it was moved to Turin in northern Italy, where it was frequently paraded through streets. This was an image that was created announcing one of those parades in Turin, Italy. Well, there's a 12th century Hungarian prayer codex, as it is called, is named after its discoverer in 1770, that has several detailed illustrations that show the burial of Jesus, and many of these details show remarkable similarities with the Shroud of Turin. However, the codex, this book, dates to close to 2 centuries earlier than the carbon-14 dates. 2 centuries earlier than the carbon-14 dates that were claimed back in 1998. On the Prayer Codex, as it's called, Jesus is shown with his hands on his pelvis, like on the Shroud of Turin. But interestingly, the hands are shown with only fingers visible, no thumbs. And if you look at the Shroud of Turin, you only see fingers, no thumbs. Also, let me direct your attention to the illustration on the bottom. It contains an enlargement. I'll circle for you there. There's an enlargement that is provided to show the details of the cloth used in the burial of Jesus. 2 characteristics of the fabric are clearly shown. It has herringbone weave pattern and also 4 distinct circles or holes. You can see those little circles or holes for you right there that kind of form an upside down L. Here's a close-up of the shroud showing the herringbone weave, which is the exact same type of weave pattern that we found in the Prayer Codex, and clearly visible are, again, as blood stains. That's all blood stains that you see there from the Shroud of Turin. Well, the enlargement on the diagram also shows those 4 conspicuous tiny circles in the shape of the letter L. These perfectly match 4 holes that can be found on the Shroud of Turin, which are believed to be poker holes. It's very, I don't know why they claim to be poker holes, but that's what they say they are. But there's 4 holes similarly matching those that are found in the Prayer Codex. The illustrations of Jesus' burial in the Prayer Codex provide some compelling evidence for the existence of the shroud up to 2 centuries before the alleged date of its fabrication from those carbon-14 dates. They argue in 1988 for a date of between 1260 and 1390, but the Prayer Codex dates to 1192 to 1195, close to 2 centuries earlier. Another interesting study that added credibility to the existence of the shroud far back in antiquity is what is known as iconography. There are a number of icons of Christ that have been found throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean, Europe, which share distinctive facial characteristics, many of which have no artistic merit. The oldest surviving icon of Christ is this 6th century icon from the St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, or what is believed to be Mount Sinai, titled Christ Pantocrator, which this is Greek for Christ, all-powerful, almighty. Well, in 1930, a French scholar by the name of Paul Vignon, an early student of the shroud, identified several common characteristics of early artistic pictures of Jesus that came to be known as Vignon markings. So when they studied these various icons, they found that these icons shared characteristics that are believed to have been derived or obtained from the Shroud of Turin. For example, if there's two wisps of hair in the center of the forehead. There's a U shape between the eyebrows that you'll see there, often squared at the bottom. There's a downward pointing triangle or V on the bridge of the nose. There's one raised eyebrow. There's a large round eyes. There's a accent on both cheeks, somewhat lower on the right. There's a forked beard. There's a gap in a beard below the lower lip, an enlarged left nostril, an accent line below the nose, a dark line just below the lower lip, a dark line at the collar. There's these common characteristics that have been found in many of these icons that, again, are believed to have come from the shroud. Several of these shared characteristics can be found on these two icons dating to the 11th and, in the other case, the 7th centuries. And notice these icons of Christ aren't the pretty little pictures of Jesus that we're used to. Yeah. Here's another. This icon was discovered in the 7th century Roman catacombs. Has several of these common characteristics, what are known as Vignon markings, including that U shape between the eyebrows. One eyebrow lifted higher than the other as well, and one has one nostril larger than the other. Here is that same painting from the Roman catacomb with a close-up of the Shroud of Turin in the background, which has those distinctive lines at the same location between the brows. So what about those carbon-14 dates and claims it was a medieval forgery? Well, the research that was conducted by the Shroud of Turin Research Project found that the linen samples that were taken for carbon-14 dating in 1988 contain cotton fibers. The interpretation of the researchers is that the fraying of the edge of the shroud had been patched at some point using cotton, possibly during the medieval period leading to the late date. Now, we cannot say with any certainty whether this cloth was the burial cloth of Jesus, but there's something very, very unique about it. There is no pigments or substances that were found on the cloth that had produced the image. How the image came to be on the cloth is a complete mystery. The existence of a cloth similarly described going back into antiquity, all the back to the 5th century, is very compelling and argues that this cloth has existed long before the medieval period. I say we cannot say with certainty, but is very interesting. And because of this new research, the Shroud of Turin has caught the eye of apologists once again. I've been to at least 2 conferences in just the last few years where an apologist did a seminar on the Shroud of Turin. So although you may have kind of forgotten about the Shroud of Turin because of that original claim of a forgery, you might want to take another look at it again.